The year was 1833. And the United States had mapped out a strategy to acquire or capture the entire territory of Florida. Until the Florida Purchase Treaty was signed in 1833, the state of Florida was still part of Spain. After the treaty, Spain sold Florida to the U.S. for a huge sum of money. But what do you think led Florida to become a U.S. territory? During the first decade of the 1800s, the United States established a permanent foothold in West Florida. This was largely based on plantation agriculture, which had been developed in other areas of the Deep South. The expansion of the United States brought political elites from the Old South to Florida. The new residents were lured by favorable Spanish terms for acquiring property. At that time, slavery played a minimal role in Florida's economy. Florida grew economically through trading along its expansive coastline. However, the increase in settlers caused clashes between whites and Indians. Eventually, the whites began to pressure the Indians to leave Florida. By the 1820s, the average number of slaves owned by a single planter doubled. This led to an increase in domestic slavery. By 1845, slavery had become firmly established in Florida. The Florida Dispute. During the colonial era, the Spanish were the dominant force in Florida. However, the native population made up a majority of the colonial population for half of the colonial era. These natives were known to be hostile to the Spanish. In 1559, a Spanish colonizing expedition led by Tristan Blunawire Rolano established a settlement at Pensacola Bay. 2 ships carried approximately 200 colonists. Afterward, Ponce Leon and his crew withdrew from the expedition. But this expedition was the first royally financed colonization attempt in Florida. In 1763, British rule in Florida began under the provisions of the Treaty of Paris. Spain had long possessed territory along the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico. However, the Spanish power in Florida was severely weakened in 1763. Spain's control over Florida was limited until the American Revolution. As a result, Indians occupied most of the territory. The Indians believed that they were given land by the Great Spirit. This led to a native uprising that culminated in the Seminole War. Spain eventually acquiesced to French settlements in Louisiana and Mobile. However, the Spanish still maintained their claim to La Florida. When the Spanish colonists arrived in Florida, they resisted attempts to make it more Spanish. Among the reasons for their resistance were the Indians' dislike of the Spanish, and the Spanish colonists' belief that Florida would become more American. The American Revolution did not end the Indian problem, however. The Indians were not especially happy with the new government, and the United States was not happy with the Indians' behavior. Florida Purchase Treaty. Despite the numerous misinformation about the purchase of Florida, the truth is that the United States did purchase Florida in 1819. The Florida Purchase Treaty was signed by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and Spanish Minister Dole Wistonis on February 22, 1819. The treaty officially ended Spanish control of Florida. The treaty was a major accomplishment and was regarded as a milestone at the time. It also solved the problem of defining the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. The boundary was established along the Sabine River in Spanish Texas and through the Rocky Mountains. The treaty also contained an amount of money about $5 million. This money was used to settle American claims against Spain. When did Florida become a state? During the 18th century, Florida was under British and Spanish colonial control. In 1819, Spain officially ceded Florida to the United States. In 1845, Florida was admitted to the Union as a slave state. By 1845, there were around 60,000 people living in Florida, mostly slaves. There were also 1,000 free blacks. The state had a constitution that included racist restrictions on immigration. There were numerous boundary disputes with the United States. In 1845, Congress agreed to admit Florida as one state. The 28th Congress passed the Statehood Statutes on March 3, 1845. In 1861, Florida joined the Confederacy. In 1868, Florida was readmitted to the Union after accepting the 13th and 14th Amendments. The statehood of Florida was not an easy one. It was a battle between the Seminole tribes and the United States government. How much did Spain sell Florida? During the American Revolution, the British and Spanish governments were in a battle for control of Florida. The Spanish were successful in conquering the British colonies in East Florida. They then divided Florida into West Florida and East Florida. During the first period of Spanish control, Spanish colonists faced attacks from Native Americans. The Spanish government also suffered from a lack of money to supply Florida. In addition, many escaped slaves found refuge in Florida. The British also attempted to regain control of Florida from Spain. During the second period of Spanish control, settlers from the newly formed United States began to settle in Florida. The Spanish government could not afford to support settlers in Florida and needed to sell it to the United States. In 1819, the United States purchased Florida from Spain for $5 million. The treaty was signed by Spanish Minister Dole Wistonis and U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. What led Florida to become a U.S. territory? During the early 1800s, Florida was a trouble spot for the United States. The area was occupied by a number of Native American tribes. There were also free blacks and escaped slaves. There were also many boundary disputes between the United States and Florida. The region was also a source of conflict with England. The first governor of Florida was Andrew Jackson. He was recruited by President James Monroe to drive Indians out of Georgia. Jackson had been involved in a heated dispute with Jose Maria Calava. After the presidential snub, he lost interest in the Florida governorship. He left Florida after a few months. He plowed through his workload quickly. The Seminole Indians of Florida became an issue for the United States in the early 1800s. The tribes occupied large areas of the area. They often provided shelter to runaway slaves from the northern states.